The desert wind carried secrets across the Apache reservation that night, just as it had for countless generations before. But this time something was different. The elders gathered around the sacred fire pit, their weathered faces etched with concern as they listened to a sound that had haunted their dreams for weeks. A wolf's howl pierced the darkness, long and mournful, echoing off the red canyon walls of Monument Valley. Yet this was no ordinary wolf call. The Apache knew the difference between the voice of their four-legged brothers and something else entirely. Something that shouldn't exist in this world. Sarah Yazzie pulled her grandmother's shawl tighter around her shoulders as she approached the circle of tribal leaders. At 28, she was the youngest member ever elected to the Navajo Nation Council. But tonight she wasn't here as a politician. She was here because her great-grandfather's spirit had visited her in a dream, speaking words in the old tongue that made her blood run cold. The wolf that howled each night at exactly 11:37 was not a wolf at all. It was a messenger, and the message it carried would change everything they thought they knew about their sacred land. The first hook came when Elder Thomas Begay raised his gnarled hand for silence. His eyes, clouded with cataracts but sharp with ancient wisdom, fixed on Sarah with an intensity that made her stomach clench. He spoke in Apache, his voice barely above a whisper, but every word cut through the night air like a blade. He told them about the last time such howling had been heard on tribal land. It was 1864, the year of the Long Walk, when Kit Carson's soldiers forced their people from their ancestral home. The night before the soldiers came, a wolf had howled at their sacred fires. But that wolf had been a warning. This one, Thomas said, was different. This one was calling someone home. Dr. Michael Crawford had spent 15 years studying Native American folklore at Arizona State University, but nothing in his research had prepared him for the phone call he received that Tuesday morning. Sarah Yazzie's voice was steady, professional, but he could hear the underlying tremor of fear. She needed someone who understood both the scientific method and the old ways. Someone who could bridge two worlds without dismissing either. Michael had grown up on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, the son of a Lakota mother and Irish father. He knew the delicate balance required to navigate between modern academia and ancient wisdom. He also knew that when tribal elders reached out to outsiders, the situation was far more serious than most people could comprehend. The drive from Tempe to the reservation took 4 hours. 4 hours during which Michael's mind raced through every piece of research he'd ever conducted on Southwest tribal legends. Skinwalkers, Wendigos, shapeshifters, all the creatures that lived in the shadows between worlds. But as he pulled into the small community of Chinle, Arizona, he realized that all his book knowledge meant nothing compared to the fear he saw in the faces of people who had lived with the supernatural their entire lives. That night, he joined the vigil at the fire pit. He brought his recording equipment, temperature sensors, electromagnetic field detectors, all the tools of modern paranormal investigation. The tribal members tolerated his gadgets with the patient indulgence they showed all white academics who thought they could quantify the spiritual world. But Michael wasn't there to debunk or prove anything. He was there to listen and, more importantly, to witness. At exactly 11:37, the howling began. It started low, almost below the threshold of human hearing, then rose to a pitch that seemed to vibrate in their bones. Michael's equipment went haywire. The electromagnetic readings spiked off the charts. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 30 seconds. But what made his blood freeze wasn't any scientific measurement. It was the look of recognition that passed between the tribal elders. They knew that voice. More than that, they were waiting for it. The second hook came when Elder Begay stood up during the howling and walked toward the darkness beyond the fire's reach. Sarah tried to stop him, grabbing his arm, but he gently pulled away. He spoke one word in Apache, a name that made every person around the fire gasp in unison. Even Michael, with his limited knowledge of the language, recognized it. Ashkiai, it meant boy, but in this context it was a specific name. A name that belonged to someone who had been dead for over a century. The howling stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like a physical presence. Then, from the darkness beyond the firelight, came the sound of footsteps. Not the padding of wolf paws, but the deliberate footfalls of someone walking upright. Someone human, The footsteps circled their gathering, staying just beyond the reach of the flames. Michael counted them automatically, his academic mind clinging to measurable facts in the face of the impossible. 7 people sat around the fire, but 9 sets of footsteps walked in the darkness. The extra footsteps belonged to Elder Begay, who had vanished into the shadows. And someone or something else. Sarah's great-grandfather had told her the story when she was 12 years old, making her promise never to repeat it to outsiders. But as she watched Michael's face in the firelight, she realized that some promises were meant to be broken when the greater good was at stake. The story began in 1862, 2 years before the Long Walk. A young Apache warrior named Ashkiai had fallen in love with a girl from a neighboring tribe, a forbidden romance that threatened to spark a war between their people. But Ashkiai was not just any warrior. He was what the elders called a bridgewalker, someone born with the ability to move between the physical and spirit worlds. When tribal pressure forced him to choose between his love and his people, Ashkiai made a choice that would echo through generations. He performed a ritual that was forbidden even among the medicine men. He split his soul in 2, leaving half in the spirit world to protect his people, while the other half remained earthbound to search for his lost love. The ritual should have killed him instantly, but bridgewalkers played by different rules than ordinary humans. Instead, Ashkiai became something caught between worlds, neither fully alive nor completely dead. For over a century and a half, his spirit had wandered the desert, calling out each night at the place where he had last seen his beloved. The tribal historians had records of his howling dating back to the 1860s, but they had always assumed it was just the echo of old grief, a spiritual wound that would eventually heal with time. They were wrong. The howling wasn't an echo of the past. It was a summons to the present. Michael's grandmother had been half Cheyenne, and she had taught him that some knowledge came through the blood rather than books. As he sat in that circle of firelight, listening to Sarah's impossible story, he felt that ancestral recognition stirring in his chest. He had studied dozens of similar legends from tribes across North America, but until this moment, he had never understood that the legends weren't metaphors or cautionary tales. They were historical records, documentation of events that existed outside the boundaries of conventional reality. When Elder Begay emerged from the darkness, he was not alone. A figure walked beside him, tall and lean, wearing traditional Apache clothing that seemed to be woven from shadow and starlight. The figure's face was ageless, neither young nor old, with features that shifted like smoke in the flickering firelight. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of solitude and longing. Ashkiai told them about the changes he had sensed in the spirit world over the past year. Dark forces were moving, entities that fed on conflict and hatred, growing stronger as the modern world became increasingly divided. These entities had found a way to cross over from the shadow realm, using places of historical trauma as doorways. The Apache Reservation, with its layers of accumulated grief and injustice, had become a beacon for such creatures. But there was a way to stop them. The ritual that had split Ashkiai's soul could be reversed, but only if someone was willing to serve as an anchor in the physical world while he completed his journey to the spirit realm. Someone with the right bloodline and the spiritual strength to survive the crossing. Someone like Sarah, whose great-grandfather had been the medicine man who originally performed the forbidden ritual. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her great-grandfather hadn't just witnessed Ashkiai's transformation. He had been the one to perform it, carrying the guilt and knowledge of that night until his death 40 years ago. The dreams she had been having, the visions of a young warrior calling her name, weren't random spiritual experiences. They were inherited memories, passed down through generations of her family line. She was connected to Ashkiai by bonds that went deeper than blood or time. Michael watched the color drain from Sarah's face as understanding dawned. He had studied enough tribal traditions to recognize the weight of inherited spiritual responsibility. Sarah wasn't just being asked to help a lost soul find peace. She was being asked to risk her own life to correct a mistake made by her ancestor over a century ago. The choice was entirely hers, but everyone around the fire knew that refusing would mean watching their homeland slowly consumed by entities that should never have been allowed to cross into the physical world. The ritual had to be performed during the dark moon, when the veil between worlds was thinnest. That gave them 3 days to prepare. 3 days for Sarah to decide whether she was willing to potentially sacrifice everything for people she had never met and a world she couldn't fully understand. 3 days for Michael to document what might be the most important paranormal event in modern history, assuming any of them survived to tell the story. The preparations began immediately. Elder Begay and the other tribal leaders gathered the necessary materials. Sacred herbs that grew only in specific canyon locations, crystals that had been blessed by generations of medicine men, and items of personal significance that would anchor the ritual participants to the physical world. Michael was given permission to observe and record, with the understanding that some knowledge was too dangerous to share with the outside world. Sarah spent those 3 days in meditation and fasting, preparing her spirit for a journey that might be one way. The dreams intensified each night, showing her glimpses of the shadow realm where hungry entities waited for their chance to flood into the physical world. She saw cities consumed by hatred and fear, people turning against each other as the dark spirits fed on their negative emotions. She also saw the possible future if the ritual succeeded. A world where the barriers between realms remained intact, where the accumulated trauma of her people could finally begin to heal. On the night of the dark moon, they gathered once again around the fire pit. This time, the entire tribal community was present, forming concentric circles around the central participants. Sarah lay on a bed of sage and sweetgrass, her body painted with symbols that predated written history. Ashkiai materialized at the edge of the firelight, more solid now, his form stabilized by the approaching ritual. Michael positioned his cameras and sensors, knowing that whatever happened tonight would challenge everything mainstream science believed about the nature of reality. Elder Begay began the chanting, his voice joined by the other medicine men. The words were in Old Apache, a dialect so ancient that only a handful of people still understood its full meaning. The fire pit erupted into flames that burned every color of the spectrum, casting shifting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The temperature fluctuated wildly, hot as summer desert one moment, cold as mountain winter the next. Sarah's consciousness began to separate from her physical body, a sensation like slowly sinking into warm water. She could see her own form lying motionless on the ground while her spiritual self rose toward a sky that had transformed into something that belonged to no earthly night. Stars moved in patterns that hurt to contemplate, and the moon phases cycled rapidly overhead, as if time itself was becoming unstable. Ashkiai appeared beside her in the space between worlds, his form now fully human and achingly young. For the first time in over a century, he looked at peace. He explained that the reversal ritual required them to travel to the exact spiritual location where his soul had been split, a place that existed outside normal geography. They would have to pass through territories controlled by the entities that wanted to escape into the physical world. If they were discovered, both their souls would be consumed, and the barriers between worlds would collapse completely. The journey through the shadow realm defied every natural law that Michael's scientific training had taught him. Sarah and Ashkiai moved through landscapes that shifted like kaleidoscope patterns, past rivers of liquid starlight and forests of crystallized time. The entities that hunted them were barely visible, existing more as sensations of hunger and malevolence than actual forms. When they finally reached their destination, Sarah understood why her great-grandfather had carried such guilt about the original ritual. The spiritual wound left by Ashkiai's soul-splitting had been slowly growing larger over the decades, creating a tear in reality that the dark entities were using as a doorway. Healing it would require Sarah to essentially rebuild the barrier using pieces of her own spiritual essence. She would survive the process, but she would never again be entirely human. Part of her would always exist in the shadow realm, serving as a guardian against future incursions. The choice, once again, was entirely hers. In the physical world, Michael watched Sarah's vital signs fluctuate on his monitors, while Elder Begay and the other medicine men maintained their chanting. Her body temperature had dropped to hypothermic levels, but she showed no signs of distress. Her brain activity registered patterns that he had never seen before, cycling through states that shouldn't have been possible for a living human. The entire reservation had gone silent. No insects chirping, no wind through the canyons. Even the distant highway traffic had somehow ceased. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for Sarah's decision. Sarah made her choice in a place that existed outside of time and physical space, knowing that the consequences would ripple through generations of her family line. She reached out and touched the spiritual wound that Ashkiai's desperate love had created, feeling the dark entities on the other side pressing against the weakening barrier. With movements that were part prayer and part surgery, she began to weave her own spiritual essence into the damaged fabric of reality. The process was agonizing and beautiful simultaneously, like being simultaneously torn apart and rebuilt on a molecular level. Ashkiai helped her, his own soul finally becoming whole as the original ritual was reversed. As the barrier strengthened and sealed, the dark entities retreated back into their own realm, their pathway to the physical world permanently severed. In the moment of completion, Sarah experienced a flash of absolute understanding about the true nature of reality, the interconnectedness of all living things, and her own place in the vast web of existence that connected past, present, and future. Then she was falling back into her physical body, gasping and choking as her consciousness slammed back into flesh and bone. The fire pit exploded in a column of white light that could be seen for miles across the reservation, then instantly died down to normal flames. The temperature returned to the warm desert night, and the sounds of the natural world resumed as if someone had suddenly turned up the volume on reality itself. Ashkiai appeared one final time in the firelight, no longer trapped between worlds but preparing for his final journey to whatever realm awaited complete souls. He spoke directly to Sarah, thanking her in words that only she could hear, then turned to Elder Begay with an expression of profound gratitude. The old medicine man nodded slowly, a lifetime of guilt finally lifting from his shoulders. As Ashkiai faded from sight for the last time, a real wolf howled somewhere in the distant canyons, a sound of wild freedom that bore no resemblance to the mournful calling that had haunted the reservation for so many nights. The ritual was complete. The barriers between worlds had been restored. The dark entities had been banished back to their own realm. But the cost had been higher than anyone had anticipated. Sarah survived the experience, but she was forever changed. Part of her consciousness would always exist in the shadow realm, making her a bridge between worlds in ways that even she didn't fully understand yet. She could see things that others couldn't, sense spiritual disturbances before they manifested in the physical world, and communicate with entities that existed outside normal reality. It was a responsibility that would define the rest of her life, and potentially the lives of her descendants. Michael's documentation of the event became the most comprehensive record of verified supernatural activity in modern academic history, though he chose to publish only carefully edited portions that wouldn't endanger the tribal community or reveal the full extent of what was possible when the barriers between worlds grew thin. His reputation in mainstream academia suffered, but he found a new purpose in bridging the gap between scientific method and indigenous wisdom traditions. Elder Begay lived for another 5 years after the ritual, finally passing peacefully with the knowledge that his grandfather's mistake had been corrected. The night before his death, he had one final conversation with Ashkiai's spirit, a meeting of old friends who had both found the peace that had eluded them for so long. The reservation returned to normal, or what passed for normal in a place where the supernatural had always been an accepted part of daily life. The nightly howling stopped completely, replaced by the natural sounds of desert wildlife and the occasional ceremonial singing that drifted from the community centers. But Sarah's transformation continued to evolve. Over the following months, she discovered that her connection to the shadow realm allowed her to help other lost souls find their way home. Spirits who had been trapped between worlds for decades or centuries began seeking her out, drawn by her unique ability to exist in both realms simultaneously. She became, in essence, a spiritual social worker, helping to resolve supernatural problems that affected both the tribal community and the wider region. The experience also deepened her commitment to preserving Apache cultural traditions, understanding now that the old ways contained practical knowledge about spiritual realities that modern society had forgotten or dismissed. She worked to establish programs that taught young tribal members about their heritage, ensuring that future generations would be prepared to handle supernatural challenges with wisdom rather than fear. Michael continued his research, but with a new understanding of the limitations of purely scientific approaches to spiritual phenomena. He developed methodologies that incorporated indigenous knowledge systems, creating a hybrid approach that respected both empirical evidence and ancestral wisdom. His work became a model for other researchers who were beginning to recognize that some aspects of human experience couldn't be quantified or explained through conventional academic frameworks. 3 years after the ritual, Sarah received a visit from representatives of other tribal communities who had heard about the events at Chinle. Similar problems were manifesting across North America, places where historical trauma had created weak points in the barriers between worlds. She realized that her role as a bridgewalker would extend far beyond her own reservation, that she had become part of a network of individuals who maintained the spiritual integrity of the continent itself. The Apache Reservation became a training ground for others who showed similar abilities, a place where people could learn to navigate between worlds safely and effectively. Sarah established formal protocols for handling supernatural emergencies, creating the first indigenous-led paranormal response team in modern history. The work was dangerous and often thankless, but it was also profoundly meaningful, addressing problems that affected entire communities but that conventional authorities were equipped to handle. Michael documented these later developments as well, building a comprehensive archive of supernatural case studies that would inform future generations of researchers and spiritual practitioners. He learned to see his role not as an objective observer but as a participant in an ongoing conversation between different ways of understanding reality. The collaboration between academic research and indigenous wisdom created new possibilities for addressing problems that crossed the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds. As Sarah's abilities continued to develop, she occasionally sensed Ashkiai's presence during particularly challenging cases, as if his spirit was still available to offer guidance and support when needed. These encounters reminded her that the connection between past and present was far more fluid than most people realized, and that the actions of previous generations continued to influence the world in ways that extended far beyond conventional cause and effect relationships. The story of every night when the wolf howled at the fire pit became a teaching tool within the Apache community, a reminder that some problems required solutions that honored both traditional wisdom and contemporary realities. It demonstrated that the spiritual challenges faced by indigenous communities were not relics of the past, but ongoing concerns that required active engagement and continuous vigilance. The younger generation of tribal members who heard Sarah's story understood that their cultural heritage wasn't just a collection of quaint customs, but a living system of knowledge about how to maintain balance between different aspects of existence. 10 years after the ritual, the Apache Reservation had become a center for spiritual healing and supernatural problem-solving that attracted people from around the world. Sarah had trained dozens of bridgewalkers, individuals from various cultural backgrounds who shared the ability to navigate between worlds safely and effectively. The network they created served as an early warning system for spiritual disturbances, allowing them to address problems before they became large enough to threaten entire communities. Michael's research had evolved into a new academic discipline that he called applied spiritual anthropology, a field that combined rigorous scientific methodology with respect for indigenous knowledge systems. Universities began offering courses based on his work, training researchers who could study supernatural phenomena without dismissing or exploiting the communities where such phenomena occurred naturally. The collaboration between Sarah and Michael demonstrated that meaningful progress in understanding spiritual realities required partnerships between different ways of knowing rather than the dominance of one approach over others. The fire pit where it all began remained an active ceremonial site, but the desperate howling of a trapped soul had been replaced by songs of gratitude and celebration. The Apache community had reclaimed not only their sacred space but also their confidence in their ability to handle spiritual challenges using their own cultural resources supported by respectful collaboration with outside allies. The story continued to unfold, but the central crisis had been resolved through courage, wisdom, and the willingness of individuals to sacrifice their own comfort for the greater good of their community and the world.